Hi, and in today's video I'm going to be exploring the merits of upgrading your mouthpiece. Now, as a complete beginner, if you've just started out and you've just bought your student instrument, shall we say, it's very normal for that saxophone to come with a very basic plastic mouthpiece. It's often of fairly poor quality. So what I've done here is I've set up my quite nice alto saxophone with one of those poor quality mouthpieces, and I'm going to give you a bit of a blast of the tone so you can get an idea of the starting point from where we're coming from. So here we are. Now, although the tone was okay in some of those middle notes, what I did find when I blew it there was it was quite inconsistent. So as I went up the scale to those, the G, the A, the B flat and the C, apart from the fact it wasn't particularly brilliantly tuned, a little bit flat, might be the mouthpiece positioning here, the tone was a little bit weak and unresponsive, not particularly clear. So immediately it's going to be an advantage to that player to upgrade the mouthpiece from the basic stock mouthpiece to, and my advice here would be to a Yamaha 4C plastic mouthpiece. Again, the Yamaha 4C is just a plastic mouthpiece like this one, but it's made to a much higher standard, and you're just going to find that the tone is much more clean and responsive and even. So I'll just give you a little demonstration of a similar kind of thing on the Yamaha 4C now. So from my point of view there, that was a much nicer experience. The sound was a little brighter, more immediate in its response. I could suddenly lay back a little bit on the sound. I didn't have to force the air through so much. This is very important as a beginner because you don't want to be forcing the air through. You want to be relaxing with your airstream and allowing the tone to naturally just flow through the instrument. So it just facilitates a much more pleasurable experience as a beginner buying a mouthpiece like this. So that's your starting point. But let's now wind on, say, 5 or 6 months or perhaps a little longer. And you're now at the point when you've developed your technique a lot more. You've got a good idea of how it physically feels to blow a decent airstream through the instrument. And you're now thinking, what's the next step in terms of developing my sound? Well, this very much lies in the secret of upgrading your mouthpiece at this stage. So I'm now going to talk about this process. Ideally, I would suggest that take this process into a store, into one of our 2 stores. Come and chat to us about it, and we will set you up and take you through the whole thing. But if you can't do that, if you are just geographically far too far from a store, hopefully this video can help you now, because I'm going to go through some of the key obvious candidates that we would recommend as mouthpiece upgrades. Play them individually so you can hear the subtle tone differences, and I'll try and talk about the response and so on as I go through that range. But as a general word of advice, the idea of upgrading your mouthpiece from a very basic plastic one, even the Yamaha 4C at about the 6-month point, really gives the player that advantage in terms of producing a fuller sound, a bigger sound, and that can be achieved by the fact that we're going to be upgrading from a basic plastic piece to an ebonite or a hard rubber piece. That's the first thing. And the second main thing that we're doing here is we're slightly increasing the tip opening. So what do I mean by the tip opening? Very quickly, it is the gap between the tip of the reed and the tip of the mouthpiece. And if we can slightly enlarge that, it'll allow the player to get a fuller airstream through the saxophone, and therefore a fuller sound and a larger dynamic range. So they're the 2 key things that we're going to do when we're talking about upgrading your mouthpiece. So I'm now going to take you through some of the key mouthpieces that I would recommend. Okay, so first of all, we've got the Salma S80 C double star here. Now, C double star is a tip opening, which, as I've just mentioned, is the gap between the tip of the reed and the tip of the mouthpiece. And the Salma tip opening system operates like this. We have C star at the very narrow end, all the way up to the higher letters E, F, and G, and so forth. But a very typical mouthpiece to upgrade to at the more elementary stage is around the C star, C double star, possibly D area. I've gone for a C double star, which is actually a very popular mouthpiece for classical players. The classical players still tend to stick with a slightly narrower tip openings and perhaps a slightly stiffer reed, and that combination just gives this slightly darker, more intense sort of focus that just works for that style of music. So I suppose I've got a medium strength reed on here. I've got the C double star. I'm not particularly a classical player, but when I play this, I do think in terms of classical lines because it evokes that playing in me as a player. So let's just play a few notes on this setup. Yeah, so very easy to control. You can hear I can diminuendo away nicely at the end there. It would just take me a little while to get used to this. It's not my regular setup, but you can hear it's got a nice, clear sound, very sort of classical orientated. So a very popular mouthpiece is the Selmer S80. Okay, I'm now going to move on to the Selmer Concept, just sticking with Selmer for a while, because I feel that the Selmer Concept has an interesting flavour of sound that's similar to the S80, but for me it's just got a little bit more of a sweetness, and perhaps even, I know this wasn't necessarily the intention, but a little bit more of a jazz flavour in there. It's a slightly bigger sound and works a little bit more for me personally, but of course it's also personal, this is. So here is the Selmer Concept. Okay, next up we've got the Mayer Ebonite mouthpiece, which is a very common and popular upgrade for alto players in particular. The thing about the Mayer is it crosses over nicely between the sort of classical styles and jazz styles. It's got a nice poppy middle ground, if you like, so it works for a broad range of styles, and in that sense it's very useful as a mouthpiece upgrade for that beginner who's just looking to play general all-round music. They're not quite sure of their style at this stage, but they just want to develop their sound. The Mayer is a very good model for that kind of playing. So I'll just give you a little blast on this. Just push it in so I'm not too flat. So as you can hear, the sound's quite big, it's quite lively. Out of all the mouthpieces I've played so far, that one has the most sort of kick in it, in terms of my feeling. Immediately it was quite bright and I almost felt like I had to tame it down a little bit. But within the mouthpiece there's the possibility to better kick out, so you can play in those kind of poppy styles. And then when you really get into it and you start to relax the throat and all these kind of important technique-y things, you can also find that softer sound within it. So very good mouthpiece, the Mayer. Right, so next up we have the Otto Link Ebonite mouthpiece. Now, this is another popular upgrade mouthpiece, and I'd always give it to you if you were to come and try a range of mouthpieces. It's probably a little bit more popular on tenor. Traditionally, it was always thought of as the standard tenor mouthpiece going back several decades in the sort of 50s, 60s kind of area. But it's still a popular mouthpiece today on both alto and tenor. And it's made in the same factory. That's where the Mayers, the modern Mayers, are made. And it's got similar properties, but for me it's just a little bit more resistant than the Mayer and has a slight sort of extra airiness in there, perhaps a little bit more of a jazziness. So slightly more on the jazzy side than the Mayer, which is a bit more of a straight down the middle, free-blowing mouthpiece. So here is the Otto Link. So next up we've got the Jody Jazz HR for alto, and for me this is a lovely mouthpiece that strikes that balance between the Mayer and the Otto Link. With the Mayer you've got that nice sort of spiky, punchy sound, very clean, and the Otto Link's got a certain amount of huskiness in it, but a bit more resistance. So this mouthpiece has that huskiness in the sound, and it's got that punch as well, but it's also very free-blowing, which is really typical of Jody pieces. So let's give this one a little bit of a blow. Very nice. Okay, so now we have the Van Doren V5 mouthpiece, available in a lot of slightly complicated tip choices, you might say, but the one I've got here is the A35, which is a medium tip opening, perhaps suitable for someone who's been playing for, say, 6-8 months, perhaps a little bit longer. If you're thinking about upgrading to one of these sooner than that, I might recommend a slightly smaller tip opening. The Van Dorens, for me, have a nice warmth of sound, quite a fullness in there. Generally speaking, they're just good all-rounders, so let's give you a little bit of a play on this one. And my final selection of mouthpiece is the D'Addario Select Jazz mouthpiece. This is a relatively new mouthpiece on the scene, and I think a lovely addition to the sort of upgrade range, if you like. It's made from a nice rubber material, and it's got that typical Mayer flavour in the sound, and perhaps just a little extra interest and depth in there, you might say. It's so much about the player feeling when you try these. I mean, you might find that you play a Mayer against this one and you find it very similar, and it's hard to pick between them, but sometimes it's just a feeling that you get as a player in terms of the sound or perhaps the resistance or what you're able to do, how it empowers you as a sax player. So let's finish with a little blast of the Select Jazz and see what you think. So I hope you've enjoyed that little spin of all these different mouthpieces. A couple of observations, probably from yourself here. I've used the same reed and the same ligature. This is a Rovner ligature that I've got here. It's a Jazz Select reed. Using consistent equipment really helps with this process, which is exactly what I'd encourage you to do if you're going to come in store. It's no good fiddling around with different reeds and ligatures if you're trying one mouthpiece and then going on to the other mouthpiece. You want to make it like a scientific controlled experiment. So that's the main thing that I want to sort of impart as I part from you now in video terms. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and please come on down to one of our stores and try a selection, or failing that, enjoy the video and the sound clips that I've just produced here, and email in or ring us with any questions that you may have.